Hello, Grand Tourists, and welcome to the Module 7 podcast, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. In this podcast, we're going to be examining the art of the Italian Renaissance. Now, as you probably know, the Renaissance was a rebirth, that's literally what the word means, of learning and culture in Europe from around 1400 to about 1600. And you have to put it in context of the Middle Ages, right? What we talked about, where a lot of classical learning was lost, even though some monks were keeping it alive. And the Middle Ages, in many ways, is not an era of flourishing in terms of the economy, in terms of the quality of life of people. A lot of times it's just about survival, which is perhaps one of the reasons why messages of faith had such appeal to people in Europe during this time. But when we get to the time of the Renaissance, we see Europe having a bit more political stability, as you might infer from this map that shows different kingdoms in Europe at the height of the Renaissance. There's also more economic prosperity. Increasingly, it's not just kings and the church that have money. In certain places, most notably Italy, you have some rich merchants who are acquiring more power. So during this time, you have people that are more economically prosperous. Now, some of this, especially in Italy, can be traced back to the Middle Ages with the Crusades. Of course, in the Crusades, you had large, basically military pilgrimages that are traveling from Western Europe to the Holy Land and reclaiming holy sites that had been taken over by Muslims who had occupied these lands. And these crusaders are often coming back from the East with some exotic goods such as silks and dyes and spices. And people started perking up in Western Europe saying, hey, this stuff is pretty cool. Let's see if we can get more of it. So commerce between East and West began to flow a bit more. And Italy, as you can see on this map, is situated at a really ideal place. It juts out into the Mediterranean. It's connected kind of at the halfway point in terms of land masses between East and West. And so there are some folks in Italy who are making quite a bit of money from the trade that's happening between the East and the West that in many ways started with the Crusades. Furthermore, you have new trade routes that are being established over land and over sea. And science is going to play a role in finding better ways to navigate, better ways to build ships. And there is an increase in scientific inquiry into the natural world. People are going to start looking at the world around them. And if you'll recall, this is a change from the Middle Ages when much of at least the cultural sight was fixed on the spiritual realms. And as science improves, along with it comes the willingness of artists to spend more time looking at the world around them, which, of course, is one of our traits of humanism. It's something the Greeks did quite a bit. And what we're going to see in the Renaissance is a spike in realism. In fact, we're going to see the most realistic art that we have seen up to this point because it is a very humanistic culture. Another sort of factor that's happening that kind of feeds into the Renaissance is Martin Luther and his challenges to the papacy. If you remember from your history classes, Martin Luther is a Catholic monk who gets frustrated with some of the corruption that he sees in Rome, and he nails his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. And he presents a challenge to the Catholic Church. And increasingly, people realize that the church maybe doesn't have all the answers, or maybe is not the sole arbiter of Christianity. And of course, Protestantism arises from this. Furthermore, and your book notes this, in Italy, we have people getting interested in the Roman ruins around them. There's kind of this rebirth of interest in classical civilization, and people begin to study classical texts that had been preserved by monks during medieval times and recover some of the classical knowledge that had been lost, and they were really gaining an interest in it. In many ways, in fact, one of the most important things you can kind of meditate on as we are going through this art The Renaissance is a rebirth of Greek humanism. It is a revival of interest in classical cultures, and many times these Renaissance artists are trying to uh, reflect the attitudes that were going on during classical times. So we have a whole lot of factors feeding into uh, why the Renaissance happens, and Italy is at the center of it. It is absolutely the cultural eye of the storm when we're talking about the Renaissance. And so, when in this podcast, when we're talking about standing on the shoulders of giants, those giants, of course, are great Italian artists of the Renaissance. Now, let's look at this map, kind of zooming in on Italy. Notice that Italy is divided into kingdoms or city states. This is not a unified country of Italy like we know today. That doesn't happen for a really long time. So, you have to think of these intense regional loyalties. Florence, people from Florence don't consider themselves Italians, they consider themselves Florentines, for example. So Italy is kind of this place where there's dynamic competition between these different kingdoms, and sometimes they're, in fact, quite often, they're fighting with each other. Now, Florence is a big deal. It's not the biggest of the kingdoms. You can see that on the map. But there's quite a bit of wealth in Florence. There are rich merchants and bankers, and these are people who can afford art. And so some of the greatest art of the Renaissance is going to come out of Florence because there are wealthy patrons there who are willing to shell out money to decorate their palaces or their villas, or to have artists make costumes and floats for parades, that sort of thing. Here's a picture of the Florence skyline with its famous cathedral or Duomo. And it's so wonderful to visit Florence and think, in many ways, these buildings are the same buildings that were looked upon by the great Renaissance artists of the 14 and 1500s. This next slide shows a portrait of one of the most famous and important figures in the Italian Renaissance, a man named Lorenzo Medici. Now, the Medici were a family of wealthy bankers in Florence. They accrued a lot of money and became really the de facto rulers of Florence. They weren't officially voted in, they were not officially political figures, but they held the purse strings and had a lot of power in Florence. And the cool thing for art is the Medici funded tons and tons of art. A lot of the greatest works of the Renaissance uh, came from the purses of the Medici family. And Lorenzo is among the greatest art patrons in his family. He's known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. So his name is going to crop up again and again if you study Renaissance artists. And speaking of Renaissance artists, let's get to a list of some of the artists we're going to be surveying. There's so many names it can get kind of confusing, so I've broken them up for you. We're going to start off talking about an artist named Giotto, an artist in not really officially in the Renaissance. He's in a transitional period from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance that I'm going to call the Proto-Renaissance. After him, we get into some of the names that many students know because of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the 1990s. I can't believe I'm referencing this in a college class. But yes, Donatello, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael are all originally Renaissance artists. And early in the Renaissance, we're going to see, look into the works of Donatello and another painter named Botticelli who did not make it to turtle status. And then we get into the High Renaissance, and these are sort of the supermen of Italian art, names that I'm sure you've heard: Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. So let's get started. Let's look at some work by Giotto and study how stylistically Renaissance art transitions out of the Middle Ages. Check out this image. This is a very famous comparison. You see it in all the art history books. Also, you go to the Uffizi Museum in Florence, one of the most famous Italian Renaissance museums in the world, and one of the first rooms you walk into has these two paintings. They're massive. They're absolutely huge. They're hanging on these big iron rings. And what I tell my students when we look at these paintings is this is the exact moment the Italian Renaissance in art gets started. course, that may be overstating a little bit, but there's a really dramatic shift that happens. We're looking at a painting on the left by an earlier Italian artist named Cimabue. It is called Madonna Enthroned. On the right, we have a painting by Giotto, who was a student of Cimabue, that's basically the same subject matter. It's Mary holding Jesus in her lap, surrounded by a lot of figures. Now, before we get into all the details about this painting, let's get into a little background information on Giotto. There are stories about Giotto that say he was a young shepherd. He was a kid working in the fields when he was discovered by Cimabue. Supposedly, he was herding his sheep, and in his spare time, he would find large flat rocks and draw pictures of the sheep on the rocks. Here was someone who was drawing from nature. He wasn't drawing out of his imagination. He wasn't trying to draw angels in the heavenly realms, things he couldn't see. He was simply looking at life around him and translating it as best he could on these rocks that he was drawing on. And Cimabue is walking through the field and comes along and sees Giotto and is like, man, that kid's pretty good. And Cimabue takes him into his studio where Giotto learns the craft of painting. But Giotto marks a major transition stylistically because he starts to look at the world around him and really try to observe what people look like and draw and paint as accurately as he can to real life. And we see that in these two images. So let's look at Cimabue's Madonna Enthroned. It's very Byzantine. It reminds us of the icons that we looked at when we were studying Byzantine art. There's something kind of generic and cookie cutter about the face of Mary, for example, and really most of the angels. It's kind of like everybody in the heavenly realms looks kind of the same. Not only that, there are some awkward things spatially in this painting. In order to convey deep space, Cimabue has taken his angels and he sort of stacked them one on top of the other, just sort of piled them up towards the top of the picture. Not only that, but if you look at the robes of the Madonna and Jesus, they're sort of like flat lines that hang limply and don't really express the volume of the figure underneath. We look at Madonna here and we're reminded of those mosaics of Justinian where we don't really feel like there's a body underneath the clothes. The lines in the fabric, the folds in the fabric seem more decorative and flat. Now we look over at Giotto's and look at his depiction of Mary and Jesus, and it's wonderful because there's a sense of an actual three-dimensional figure under this clothing. We look at her bosom, we look at her knees, and it feels like this is actual fabric draped over a human body. A second thing, look at the angels or the holy figures on the sides. Instead of being stacked all the way up to the top, they are placed in front of each other, almost like a crowd scene. This is a lot more realistic. It's much more akin to how we would actually observe masses of people. There's also a bit more individuality in the faces of all these characters in Giotto's painting. They're closer to looking like real human beings. The shading on the faces seems more convincing. There are different facial characteristics. So there's a uniqueness about these characters in Giotto's painting. He seems a bit closer to actually painting real human beings than Cimabue does. And Cimabue's composition is awesome. I mean, it's really cool and kind of holy looking, but Giotto's has the feel of humanity. And that's one of the most wonderful things about Giotto, who comes along in the 1300s and starts to draw from life. He injects a real sense of humanity into his paintings. Let's look at an example of this. This is a painting of his called The Lamentation. And if you look at it and you know anything about the Bible, you can probably figure out what the subject matter is. The dead Christ has been taken down off of the cross. He's about to be put in his tomb, and he is there at the bottom of the composition, and all these figures gather around him. And if we know enough about some of the conventions of Christian painting, we can even identify some of these figures. For example, the old man to the right-hand side with the receded hairline and the gray beard, that is St. Peter, often depicted as the oldest person in scenes like this. There's a younger man who is standing kind of over Jesus, looking down, throwing his arms backwards. That is John, the Apostle John, who's often depicted young and beardless. We have the women attending to Jesus, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus. What's particularly moving about this painting, though, is the expressions of grief on the faces of these figures. They actually really do seem sad that Jesus is dead. And that's something Giotto does really well. I mean, we see furrowed brows, we see sincere expressions of mourning. These are not ethereal, heavenly, angelic ghosts who are sort of floating around like we might see in the Byzantine mosaics. These are actual people who are really mourning. And that is one of the most wonderful things about Giotto's paintings. Of course, Giotto is simply an early vanguard of things to come. He is the beginning of this humanism that we are going to see resurge in Italy during this time. And it only gets more and more intense in terms of this love of humanism and classical civilization. Remember that these artists are going to be looking at the ruins around them, and also sculptures from antiquity are going to be unearthed and excavated. And all of these Renaissance Italians are going to be seeing ancient Greek and Roman figures. And that's certainly going to be influential on our next artist, who is a sculptor, first and foremost. His name is Donatello. And he single handedly resurrects basically Greek sculpture from the past. Remember, during the Middle Ages, the realism in depiction of the human figure really goes down. And if you think about the sculptures we looked at, from Constantine's massive head to some of the figures that are on the cathedrals, there is a certain rigidity about sculptures. There's a lack of good proportion. They don't really seem like human beings. And usually, when there are sculptures, especially in the Middle Ages on cathedrals, they don't stand by themselves. They're often sort of attached to walls, like with their backs basically glued to the wall. And the concept of a sculpture that stands on its own, that you can walk around and check out, is one that dies out during the Middle Ages. Then Donatello comes along, and he begins to make sculptures intended to be standalone pieces. They're not attached to buildings. You can walk around them, you can look at them from all sides. Not only that, but he brings back the contrapposto pose. Do you remember that from studying the Greek sculptures? This is when the weight of a figure is more on one leg than the other. We see that in his sculpture of David here, the great biblical hero. Notice the way the hips are at an angle and the shoulders are also at an angle. This is contrapposto, and the world has not seen this for 1,000 years, not since the Greeks and the Romans, and Donatello brings it back. So he's a huge, huge influence on sculpture. He is taking the best of what the Greeks and Romans did and representing it in his own work. So let's look at David. You can see, again, he's in contrapposto pose. He has a sword. He's just cut off Goliath's head, and you can see his foot is up on Goliath's head, the giant that he slew with the slingshot. Now, notice something interesting. David is like totally nude. This is probably not historically accurate if we're trying to be true to the biblical text. He probably had some sort of shepherd's garment on. But the Renaissance, especially in Italy, is a time of humanism, and it's almost like the Greeks part two. And remember, the Greeks loved the naked human form, and that comes out in Renaissance sculpture. This is very humanistic. We don't really see God in the picture. You know, God who guided David's hand as he slung the stone into the giant's forehead. God's not around. This is a self-sufficient, beautiful figure standing in a beautiful pose, and hence very humanistic. One of the things I should say that we have during this time is an attempt on the part of Renaissance scholars to reconcile Christian belief with pagan traditions, and that's going to be a theme we return to several times. But one of the ideas that's going to be in the Renaissance is that the nude human body glorifies God because God actually created man and he was good, right? So there is kind of this appropriation of pagan representation of the nude human figure and Christianizing it, saying this celebrates the beautiful forms that God has made. Now that's Donatello's David. Let's look at this next Donatello work. This is Mary Magdalene. And it shows Donatello's range because this isn't quite going all the way down the Greek route. This doesn't show an idealized, glorified, perfect human body. So that's kind of refreshing. So Donatello isn't going all the way with Greek aesthetics in every single one of his sculptures. Mary Magdalene, of course, is one of the women who followed Jesus around. There's not a lot we know about her from Scripture, but there was an early tradition that arose in the church that she used to be a prostitute until she started following Jesus, and then she repented of her previous lifestyle and became a very holy person. Now, we don't know that for sure. The Bible doesn't say that, it's just tradition. But you see Mary Magdalene in art again and again, and very often she is depicted as someone who is repenting of her past sins, who's mourning her previous life before she began to follow Christ. And this sculpture is a very powerful visual representation of a figure who is in mourning, who is in penitence. Let's look at the way Donatello visually expresses this. For one thing, she's dressed in these really ratty, ragged out clothes. It almost reminds us of people in the Old Testament who would dress in sackcloth and ashes. Her hands are coming together in a position of prayer. Look at her face. This is kind of a ragged out looking face. Her eyes are sunken. She doesn't have much in the way of lips. Her cheeks are hollow. Her hair is kind of gross looking. This is a woman who is not beautiful on the outside, but there is an inner spiritual beauty because her heart's in the right place. I should add that this sculpture at the museum in Florence, where it's placed, it's one of the best examples of sculpture being in the perfect place because she is positioned facing a wall that has a crucifix on it, and it looks like she's looking at the crucified Christ and mourning his death and praying for him is just absolutely moving. So if you go to Florence, go to the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo, and you can see her in this position. Our next early Renaissance artist is a painter named Botticelli. And Botticelli makes these massive paintings. You go to the Uffizi Museum in Florence, and there's an entire room that's taken up with his works, and they're all like super huge. And something notable about Botticelli is he's known for painting these scenes from mythology, these pagan themes. And again, this is the attempt on the part of many of these Italian humanists to reconcile Christian theology and pagan tradition. Let's look at this first painting. It's called The Birth of Venus. It depicts the mythological story in which the goddess Venus, or Aphrodite, was born on the foam of the ocean, and she was blown onto shore. And that's what we see here. It's sometimes humorously called Venus on the half shell because Botticelli placed her on this big clamshell that's acting like a boat. On the left-hand side, we see Zephyrus, the god of the winds, blowing her into shore, and you can see her hair whipping around, and she's somewhat demurely covering her nakedness with her hair and her hand. And there on the shore is an attendant, ready to clothe her nakedness with a gown. Now, something kind of interesting about Botticelli's Venus is the fact that she has blonde hair. And that's kind of weird considering that most women in Italy have dark hair. And I was on a museum tour and I heard an explanation for this. The women of Italy in Florence thought blonde hair was a status symbol. It meant you were a rich and noble person. So they would actually bleach their hair blonde, and the substance they would use to do the bleaching was horse urine. So, I'm not recommending that as any sort of beauty tip, but that's why a lot of these Italian women have blonde hair in these paintings. Now, the funny thing is, these Italians were putting kind of a Christian spin on these pagan myths. Uh, Venus is almost seen as kind of an Eve figure in this, like Adam and Eve, like in the Garden of Eden. And indeed, there's kind of a garden on the right hand side. The next painting we're going to look at is very much about a garden. It's called Primavera, or Spring. And in this painting, we have some characters actually from the first painting that we looked at. We have Venus in the middle of the painting presiding over her garden. You can see fruit trees in the upper part. And you can probably even identify some of the figures. Who do you think the little baby with the bow and arrow above Venus is? Of course, that's Cupid. And he is up to his mischief. He is aiming his bow into a group of three women known as the Three Graces. They're just kind of hanging out, dancing in the garden. Over on the right-hand side of the picture, we have our old buddy Zephyrus, again, the god of the winds, although he looks like he's been blowing too much because he looks pretty blue. And he is chasing after a woman who in mythology is named Chloris. She is a nymph that he is pursuing, and he eventually catches her and makes her his wife. And she's actually transformed into a goddess, and that is represented by the woman we see immediately to the left of the rather stressed out looking Chloris. This is the goddess of spring with flowers in her hair and flowers on her dress. Notice the left-hand side of the picture, we have the appearance of another god. This is the god Mercury, or Hermes, identifiable by what's called his caduceus staff. This is the staff with the snakes wound around it. And there on the left-hand side of the picture, he's poking at this rain cloud that's trying to get into this beautiful garden, perhaps a reference to April showers, something that's attempting to spoil the sort of pastoral beauty of this scene, and he stands there as a guard keeping away the rain clouds. So this is a pretty upbeat painting. This is the sort of thing that would be commissioned not for a church, but for the house of a rich person. This next image, we have a close-up of the goddess of spring, and she almost looks kind of drugged out. Her eyes are at half lid. It's like she's saying, "Hey man, what's going on?" You know, there's something almost kind of, she looks like, I always think of a hippie. But look at the style that she's painted in. This is so Botticelli. Botticelli has this very crisp, hard-edged style. You look at the side of her cheek, and there's like this crisp line that's drawn. You look at all the flowers, and they're very flat, almost like paper cutouts. So look for that in Botticelli. A lot of times he has these very clean, hard edges in his paintings. It wasn't all pagan myths for Botticelli, however. He also did some Christian subjects, although he's most known for his mythological subjects. This next painting is absolutely one of my favorite Botticelli's. It's another lamentation scene, kind of like Giotto's, but look how far representation of the human figure has come in this painting. A lot more realistic. And I just love the drama of this painting. The body of Christ sprawls across the lap of his mother, and he is beardless and youthful, and he has kind of an idealized body. Mary herself, the woman in black and white, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is swooning in grief. She's fainting, and she's being caught and supported by John, the disciple of Jesus, who, of course, Jesus told to look after his mother while he was hanging on the cross. Over on the right-hand side, we again have Peter, identifiable as an old man with a beard, and even more so because he is holding a key. You can see that in his hand. That is a symbol of Peter. If you see any sculpture or painting in Rome that has a dude holding a key, you can know for a fact that's Peter. This comes from the scripture where Jesus tells Peter the rather mysterious line that the keys of the kingdom will be given to you, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loose in heaven. One of the fun aspects of this picture is the halos. The halos are almost like pizza pans that are balanced on their heads. They're actually sort of three-dimensional kind of things. I really like that. But I just love the composition of this painting. I love the colors. Really great painting. I hope you like it too. All right, let's move into what we call the High Renaissance. We're moving into the 1500s, and this is where the giants of the Renaissance are to be found. The greatest names, names that have become famous the world over. So let's start with Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci is the archetypal Renaissance man. The whole concept of a Renaissance man comes from Leonardo. And of course, by Renaissance man, we mean someone who can do a lot of things really well. Not a jack of all trades, master of none, but a jack of all trades and master of all. There's some Renaissance era writing about Leonardo in which we learn that not only was he a great painter, but he was a really great musician. He could play the lyre and sing really beautifully. Actually, I think it was the lute. I'm not sure what a difference in a lute and a lyre is, but Leonardo could play it. He could sing really well. He was handsome. He was athletic. Supposedly, he could take a horseshoe and bend it in his bare hands. This guy could do everything. It's absolutely nauseating. He was not only an artist, but he was an architect, an inventor, an observer of nature, and a scientist. And he was one of these people that everybody liked having around. He was a great conversationalist. He was funny. He always had great stories. In fact, kings enjoyed just having him in their courts, even if he wasn't doing very much. A funny thing about Leonardo, though, is that he had this incredibly inquisitive mind. He was always inquiring into natural phenomena and how things worked. And I think along with this came a little bit of ADD. He had trouble focusing, he had trouble finishing things because his mind would jump from subject to subject. And so Leonardo left in his wake a lot of unfinished works. He's not known as someone who produced a lot of finished paintings in his life. But let's at least look at some of the paintings he did finish. This is the most famous and one of the most famous images in art history. This is, of course, the Mona Lisa. And this is a picture of someone who is probably absolutely not important historically. Her name was Lisa Giocondo. She was the wife of a wealthy Florentine. And in fact, the name Mona Lisa, the word Mona actually is a contraction of Madonna or My Lady. So the literal translation of this might be My Lady Lisa. Why is it famous? Well, several reasons. First, it's just very technically well done. The chiaroscuro in her face, remember chiaroscuro, the transition of values to make things look rounded. The chiaroscuro in her face is really convincing. It looks really rounded, and all the parts of chiaroscuro are present here, from the highlights to the cores of the shadows to reflected light and cast shadow. All that stuff is present. So technically, it's really well rendered. Also, this is one of the first times in art history when a portrait is placed in front of a landscape, in this case, kind of a fantastical, imaginary landscape that gets fuzzier as you go off into the distance, a great example of atmospheric perspective. The whole portrait is characterized by a technique called sfumato, which means sort of smoky. And notice how there's a fuzziness kind of about the whole thing. Leonardo really dealt in these kind of smoky edges. Finally, there is the famous smile. And I look at that and I'm like, she's not really smiling. She really seems sort of on the verge of smiling. People have wondered for years at her facial expression. What is she thinking? What's she about to do? What's she about to say? And I think that's some of the appeal of this portrait, which Leonardo himself certainly liked this portrait. He carried a version of it with him until the day he died. This next image is the other famous Leonardo painting that everybody knows about. This is, of course, his Last Supper. It was painted on the wall of a monastery, so it's not on canvas. It's not in a museum. It's actually in this monastery. I think it's in Milan. Anyway, in this painting, for one thing, I should say the painting is in terrible condition. It's been flaking off the wall for hundreds of years. And a big reason for this is that Leonardo, who was a restless experimenter, decided to try new paint mixtures and some new painting mediums on this wall painting instead of using the traditional choice, something called fresco, for painting on a wall. And apparently, this thing started to disintegrate very soon after he finished it. And for hundreds of years, every morning a janitor has been coming in and sweeping the floor and sweeping away little flecks of the Last Supper. So this is a major restoration issue, and it's been a headache for art historians. But even in its badly deteriorated state, we can see some pretty awesome things about it. This painting depicts the moment at which Jesus, at the Last Supper, tells his disciples that one of them is going to betray him. And you can see they're all arguing amongst themselves. They're all accusing each other, saying, "Surely not me, is it you?" And so forth. Leonardo has arranged the 12 disciples in four groups of three. So there's kind of a beautiful, kind of mathematical harmony about that. He has also arranged the perspective of the room so that all of the lines of perspective converge on the head of Christ, specifically his right eye. So we can see that in this next picture that has lines superimposed on some of the diagonals in the architecture. So this painting is full of sort of underlying mathematical beauty and harmony. And that's a very Renaissance sort of thing. They're so much like the Greeks, and the Greeks are all about bringing beautiful harmony and proportions to their temples, for example. And so a lot of artists of the Italian Renaissance are really interesting in having an harmonious and visible underlying structure for their paintings, and we certainly see that in The Last Supper. Let's look at a couple of details in The Last Supper. One is the group of three figures to Jesus's right hand, a subject of great interest for fans of Dan Brown and his Da Vinci Code book. We have a group of three figures: Peter, Judas, and John the disciple. The Bible describes John the disciple as leaning against Jesus and asking him a question. So he is often, in fact, almost always in these Last Supper pictures, depicted as being next to Jesus. And he is the beardless guy who is there immediately to Jesus's right. And this, of course, is who Dan Brown sort of points out as being Mary Magdalene. That is absolute bunk. Any art historian will tell you that is not Mary Magdalene. That is just something that was made up for the Da Vinci Code. So don't believe a word of it. It's absolutely ridiculous. Peter is in this little arrangement. He is the old man with the gray beard, and he holds a knife in his hand. You can see his elbow is out and his hand is bent around backwards, and the knife is pointing away. This is a prefiguring of him cutting off the ear of the servant in Gethsemane. If you read the Bible, Peter is this wonderful character. He's so impulsive and often acts before he thinks, and that's a great example of his impulsive nature. So it's a little bit of prefiguring, of foreshadowing of the violence in the Garden of Gethsemane. And there is Judas clutching his money bag in front of both of them. Judas is right next to Jesus. This is a very revolutionary aspect of this painting, to include Judas on the same side of the table as everybody else. A lot of earlier paintings of the Last Supper would place Judas isolated from the rest of the disciples, sometimes even with a little demon on his shoulder. And in this next image, we have Jesus looking serene and calm, kind of the eye of the storm, his head framed by a window with the landscape behind it. All right, those are the only two Leonardo paintings we're going to look at, in part because he didn't do just a whole lot of paintings, and also because he is known very much as an idea man, someone who was interested in a lot of different subjects and just came up with ideas related to these subjects. So we're going to wrap up by looking at some pages from his sketchbooks. Let's look at this first image. This is his famous drawing of a fetus in utero. He was someone who was very much interested in biology. He was someone who dissected cadavers. That's one of the most famous stories that's associated with him. And look at all the little drawings on this page. There seem to be studies of the wall of the uterus, even a little architectural drawing. That's just classic Leonardo. You might have a picture of some sort of work of architecture or machine, and then a drawing on the same page of a couple of cats playing. His mind just sort of went from subject to subject. This next series of images shows Leonardo's interest in flight. He was someone who loved watching birds. He would watch birds for hours, and he was obsessed with people someday being able to fly. So on the left-hand side, we have an image of his helicopter. It is the thing that has the sort of screw-like sail on top of it. And the idea is there's a platform at the bottom, and men stand on this platform and they push these bars in front of them to rotate a vertical shaft that runs throughout the whole machine. This vertical shaft actually spins this spiral wing to cut into the air to create vertical movement. So here's his early helicopter. Below that, we have an image of a man pumping a long lever that activates a wing. In the middle section, we have some images of flying devices, and we have a picture of a parachute. You can see there's a close-up of it. So Leonardo is someone ahead of his time. He is just doing these drawings. He's not actually necessarily bringing these things to life or making models or making actual scale versions of them, but he's a great idea man. Some of his other innovations include uh, possibly the world's first scuba gear, and also a drawing of a bicycle that is actually disputed. It may or may not be a hoax, but it looks strikingly like contemporary bicycles, so that's pretty cool. I should mention, by the way, back on this idea of flight, Leonardo was kind of a hippie. He was a vegetarian and he hated killing things. And there are stories about him going through the market and someone would be selling doves or pigeons, and he would buy the whole cage of doves, and he would open the door and release them because he hated seeing birds trapped and imprisoned. And that love of peace makes some of his drawings, like what we see on these next sketchbook pages, hard to comprehend. These are war machines. One of the ways that Leonardo actually sold himself to patrons is as a military engineer. There's this one cover letter he wrote to a duke trying to get hired in this duke's court, and he said, "Dear Duke, I can make all sorts of cool war machinery, ways of tunneling under fortifications and catapults, and all sorts of war chariots, blah, 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 blah. I'm a great military engineer." And then in the last line of the letter, almost as an afterthought, he says, "By the way, I can also do painting and sculpture, and I'm a decent artist." So it's kind of funny how he sold himself. But look at these two pictures. These are absolutely horrific. You wouldn't expect these to come from the mind of a pacifist. These are scythe chariots. They are machines that are designed to be hooked up to horses and driven through a battlefield. And as they're driven, the wheels turn kind of a crankshaft, which turns a bunch of rotating scythes or sickles, huge cutting blades. And the idea is you drive these chariots into a crowd and it chops off people's arms and legs. So here are two different designs for some of these awful, awful chariots. The one on the top, he's actually drawn images of people who have amputated limbs, and the bottom one just shows a different configuration. So, a man of contradictions here, a peace loving designer of horrible military implements. But that's part of the fascination with Leonardo. Not only is he multi talented and interested in a whole lot of things, we also can't quite pin him down. He's kind of a man of mystery. All right, let's move on to another master of the High Renaissance, another household name. This is Michelangelo. His full name is Michelangelo Buonarroti, so you might hear him called that. Uh, and Michelangelo is someone who considers himself first and foremost a sculptor. And there's a story about him when he was young. His mother handed him to a wet nurse to be nursed, and this woman was the wife of a stonecutter, someone whose job it was to go into quarries and choose blocks of stone actually for sculpture. And Michelangelo always said that through his wet nurse's milk, he drew in the tools of his trade, the hammer and the chisel. Michelangelo, from a very early age, wanted to be a sculptor, and that's kind of all he wanted to do. So let's look at this first image. This is his famous Pietà, which is now on display in St. Peter's in the Vatican. And Pietà is just a word that means pity. And in art history terms, it is a word that's applied to any image of Mary mourning over Jesus, often holding his body or just looking down on his body. And he completed the sculpture when he was very young, in his early 20s, and it still has this emotional power. Uh, I've been to the Vatican with some of my students, and there was one student who, after we came out, just broke down and started crying because he was so moved by the Pietà. This is sculpted in marble, and under the touch of Michelangelo, marble might as well be like butter. He can manipulate this material with great skill, and he can reproduce folds in fabric, skin sort of denting in under someone's fingers. He's just absolutely a master of marble. And there's some curious things about this sculpture. Initially, when he made it, people said there's no way an artist this young could have made so amazing a sculpture. And so he supposedly signed it. There's a sash that goes across the Virgin's chest, and he put his name on that sash. Notice how young Mary is. Uh, there are different theories about that. One is there's a Catholic doctrine that says Mary was a virgin her entire life. And that is often reflected in terms of art by giving her very young features. And so, in fact, it seems age wise that she in this sculpture she almost doesn't look like his mother. She looks like she could be a sister, even a younger sister. Another interpretation is that this is an image of Mary as a very young woman before Jesus has grown up, and she's sort of seeing a premonition, a vision of things to come. And with one hand, she holds her son as if to keep him with her, and with the other hand, she extends it out as if she is offering her son to the world. So simultaneously, uh, with the instincts of a mother wanting to keep her son, and on the other hand, offering him up for all of humanity. Just a marvelous sculpture. And of course, in this next image, we have Michelangelo's famous sculpture, the David, now on view at the Accademia Gallery in Florence. Michelangelo, by the way, is the quintessential Florentine. That's where he finds his identity. And unlike Leonardo, he doesn't really have a whole lot of friends. He's kind of grouchy and hard to work with. But the few friends that he does have are Florentines, a very close knit group of Florentines. He trusts them. David, by the way, the actual Bible character of David, is something of a patron saint of the city of Florence. Florence, as we saw on the map, is not the biggest city state in Italy. And it was always having to defend itself against larger kingdoms. And so it saw itself as a sort of David fighting off Goliaths. So the city of Florence commissioned a statue of David. And there was initially a sculptor who tried to tackle it out of a big block of marble, a block of marble that was so huge that it had a nickname. It was called Il Gigante, the giant, the block that no artist could tame. And so this first artist attempted to start a sculpture. He drilled out a hole for the legs in this massive block of marble, and that's about as far as he got. He was like, this block is way too big for me to do anything with. And so the block of marble was put aside for many years, out in the elements, under the rain and sun, until Michelangelo comes along and says, I can take this on. I can carve this massive block of marble. And so the city fathers of Florence said, what do we have to lose? They give him the block of marble, and Michelangelo carves this super famous sculpture. It's become an icon of the Renaissance, and it's really, really tall. It has its own little room in the museum that it's in. You should definitely go see it. It's very impressive. David, like Donatello's David, stands in a contrapposto pose, also nude, very humanistic, very Greek in its sensibilities. It could almost be a Greek sculpture. By the way, the proportions are kind of interesting. The head and the hands in the sculpture are really, really big. If you cover up the head with a finger or a hand and try to imagine how big a head should be for this kind of body, and then you remove your hand, the head seems really huge. Perhaps that's because this sculpture was initially intended to be placed at a very high level where people are looking at it from below, and Michelangelo wanted to make sure the facial features are visible. Michelangelo depicts David at the moment at which he is making the decision to fight Goliath. It is a very restrained sculpture. He's not in motion, he's not whipping around his slingshot. He's sizing up his component, and there's a lot of potential energy in this sculpture. His body is ready for action, but it's not really in action. And his slingshot is actually, as you can see in these pictures, draped across his back. One end of it is in his upper hand, the other end is in his lower hand. And if you look at these details of the hand and head, you can see Michelangelo's mastery of marble. All the little curls in his hair are carefully carved and undercut. The veins in the hand are included in the sculpture as well. So here is a master at the top of his game. These next images show some figures that have come to be known as the prisoners because they are sculptures that are kind of still imprisoned in their original stone. Michelangelo's philosophy of sculpture is that the sculptor's job is simply to look at the block of marble, imagine a figure trapped in it, and release that figure from the confinement of its stone. The sculptor is essentially a liberator, and he believed that God sets the figures, the statues in the stone, and the sculpture simply frees them. So these are some unfinished sculptures. And they're actually some of my favorites because they're so interesting. It almost seems like these figures actually are trying to wrestle with the rock and free themselves from the matrix of the marble that they're encased in. They seem to be struggling. And you can see some areas are finished and smooth, and some areas are still rough stone. Now, why did Michelangelo do this? Did he simply not get around to finishing these? Or is it that he felt these really capture his philosophy of a figure struggling to get out of the rock? Just some interesting questions that are raised by these series of sculptures. By the way, they're in the same museum as the David, so you need to go and you need to see all of them. They're really fantastic. Now, one of the biggest commissions that Michelangelo gets is for a pope named Julius II, who is known as the warrior pope. He's someone who is always off on military campaigns, trying to expand the Vatican's territory. So there could be a big debate about whether that is a very Christian way for a pope to act. But one thing about Julius II is he wants to have an impressive legacy. And he hires Michelangelo to carve statues for his tomb, and he wants like 40 something figures on his tomb. So Michelangelo is seriously pumped about this. This is a sculpture that could occupy him the rest of his life. So he gets to work on the tomb of Julius II, but Julius II, unfortunately, is something of a fickle patron, and he takes Michelangelo off of the tomb project, and he tells Michelangelo he wants him to paint a ceiling of a chapel that his uncle, a man named Pope Sixtus, actually constructed. And of course, the chapel is known as the Sistine Chapel after this uncle of Julius II. And he brings Michelangelo in and shows him this massive ceiling and says, I want you to decorate this ceiling. And Michelangelo says, look, I'm a sculptor, not a painter. I don't want to do this. Can I just get back to your tomb? And Julius says, forget it. I'm the Pope. I tell you what to do. I pay the bills around here. You're going to paint this dadgum ceiling. And so Michelangelo begrudgingly buckles down and gets to it. And in the course of a couple of years, this artist, who only wants to sculpt, doesn't consider himself a painter, churns out one of the world's greatest masterpieces of painting. It's a Herculean feat. It's almost staggering that a single person conceived of and basically executed this entire work. He did have some assistants who were helping him with paint mixing and some simple execution on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but a large percentage of it was completed by Michelangelo himself. Now here's the breakdown of the imagery and symbolism of the Sistine Chapel. The middle strip that runs down the length of the chapel contains different scenes from the book of Genesis. At one end, in this picture on the right-hand side, God separates the light and the dark, creates the sun and the moon, separates the sky from the water, and then he creates Adam. After that, he creates Eve, and Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, and then later we have some scenes from Noah and the flood and so forth. So it's early stuff from Genesis, and then he surrounds this with other figures. We have Old Testament prophets who predicted the coming of Christ. We have other figures called sibyls, which are female figures that were Greek prophetesses, pagan prophetesses, who supposedly foretold the coming of Christ. Who knows if that's true, but there was a belief in the Renaissance, again, with their interest in reconciling classical and Christian cultures. There was an interest in prophecies like this. Now, what's really awesome about the Sistine Chapel is the fact that the painting medium that it's executed in is extremely difficult to work in. It's a technique called fresco. And in fresco, you take wet plaster and you smear or trowel a thin layer of wet plaster on a ceiling or a wall. And while that plaster is still wet, you take pigments on brushes and you paint into the wet plaster. And when the wet plaster dries, it grabs that pigment and sort of sucks it in, and the paint literally becomes a part of the wall. So it's an extremely permanent painting process, but it's about the most difficult painting process there is. You can only work on about 1 square yard per day, and that's working at a really fast rate. And you have to do all the painting before the plaster dries. And if you mess up and the plaster dries, you have to chip it off and start all over. So that is another level of difficulty we see in the Sistine Chapel, and it makes Michelangelo's feat all the more amazing. Let's look at a close-up of the most famous panel from the Sistine Chapel. And this, of course, is the famous creation of Adam scene. In this image, we have God, the Father, being supported and held up by all of these angels. And we have a sense of the weight of this figure of God the Father, because it takes all these people to hold him up. And he reaches out this really strong arm, extends his finger to sort of inject the spark of life into Adam, who reclines sort of on the earth. And this is pretty edgy. If you remember the Byzantine hesitation to depict God as a human, Michelangelo has no such qualms. He totally goes for it. And here, God is depicted as a person. This is super humanistic, right? This is where our idea of God as an old man with a long beard comes from, the Sistine Chapel. This next panel shows in one scene the complete fall of human beings. Adam and Eve are in the garden. They're taking the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There is the serpent wrapped around the trunk, extending the fruit to Eve. And in the same scene, after the fall, we see Adam and Eve being driven out of the garden by an angel with a sword. So the complete story of mankind messing up is told in this one panel. Now, part of the story of the Sistine Chapel is the story of its restoration. Remember, this is an actual working chapel that was used in the Vatican. And for years, they'd been using candles and incense in this thing, and a lot of grime had gotten on the ceiling and the walls. They were kind of coated with soot. And in the 1970s, somebody said, hey, we should clean off these things and restore them. And they began to do that. And underneath all of this soot and grime were these really bright colors. And initially, restorationists started freaking out because they were like, I can't believe this. I mean, our conception of the Sistine Chapel is it's kind of brown and gray, and that's how Michelangelo painted it. And we're probably taking off some of the upper levels of his actual painting. And so there was a big controversy about it, but once they cleaned off the ceiling, they decided, I guess he must have actually used bright colors to begin with. After all, the ceiling is really far away from the viewer, so you stand there on the floor and you look up, and these bright colors really pop out at you. So it's just marvelous. So here's some before and after images of the Sistine Chapel restoration, and you can imagine what a glorious thing it was to behold these bright colors for the first time. Well, back to Michelangelo. He eventually finishes the ceiling, and he's able to get back to his sculpture until 20-something years later, a new pope comes along and says, Michelangelo, I want you to paint the end wall of the Sistine Chapel. And Michelangelo once again says, I'm just a sculptor. I don't want to paint. and the Pope once again pulls the Pope card, so Michelangelo has to do it. And when Michelangelo does stuff, he goes all the way. So he painted a Last Judgment scene on the end wall of the Sistine Chapel. We have Christ coming down from heaven to judge the world, and some people are going up into heaven, and some people are going down into hell. Here's a close-up of Jesus, powerful torso, raising his arm in a very ambiguous gesture. Is he greeting people, welcoming them to heaven, or is he about to sweep his arm across the sky and cast people down into hell? It's kind of unknown. There's Mary, his mother, at his side, and he's surrounded by saints and holy people, one of whom is to the lower right of Christ. He's near the left foot of Christ, and this is Saint Bartholomew. And it's one of the creepier aspects of the Last Judgment painting. Often, martyrs are holding instruments and symbols of their martyrdom, and according to tradition, Bartholomew was skinned alive. And so here, Bartholomew is at the foot of Christ, and in one hand he is holding his flayed skin, and in the other hand he's holding his knife. And one of the kind of weird or creepy details is that Michelangelo put his own self-portrait onto this skinned body. That's actually Michelangelo's head on the skin. Another fun fact in this Last Judgment image is a figure that can be seen in the lower right of the painting. This is a figure in hell, and you can see it's a man with donkey's ears with a snake wrapped around him, crushing him. This is actually a portrait of a church official who came in one day and critiqued Michelangelo's work. He said, it's inappropriate in a house of worship to have all these naked bodies. And so Michelangelo got his revenge by painting the portrait of this church official down in hell being tortured. So the message is never cross an artist. They'll always find ways to get even with you in their art. Now, before we leave Michelangelo altogether, I'd just like to tell you a few little interesting things about his personality. I said earlier that he was kind of grouchy and didn't trust a lot of people, and in many ways, he's almost the opposite of Leonardo in his personality. He was a loner. He preferred kind of working by himself or in small groups of people. He often clashed with his patrons, especially Julius II. Their arguments are legendary. He was also someone who practically lived like a monk. He didn't indulge in wine and women, and he also didn't take very good care of his personal hygiene. He was someone who would wear the same clothes for just days and days and days, and there are stories about him taking off his boots, and he'd had them on so long that when he took them off, the skin of his legs came off with his boots. So kind of a gross, untidy person, not necessarily the sort of person you'd want to be friends with, but he did create some of the world's greatest art, and he lived to a really ripe old age. I think like 89 or 90 or something like that. So lived quite a while. Now that is in opposition to this next artist, a guy named Raphael, who, kind of like Leonardo, was popular and ran in a lot of popular crowds, and something of a party boy. He, unlike Michelangelo, died at an early age after a night of carousing. Here is Raphael's most famous painting. It's commonly called the School of Athens, and it was a commission from Pope Julius II, the same pope who commissioned the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And Raphael received the assignment to decorate the papal apartments in the Vatican, and this one went in the papal library. And it's interesting, here in the headquarters of Catholicism, in the heart of the Roman Catholic Church, you have this painting of pagan philosophers and scientists and mathematicians. This is basically a huge composition that gathers together all the famous intellects of the ancient world from Greece and Rome and puts them in an imaginary setting. So in the center, we have Plato and Aristotle. Plato's on the left, Aristotle's on the right. And you can see Plato pointing upwards to those ideal forms, which he said everything on earth is basically a shadowy copy of. This whole composition shows us what Raphael was really good at. He was really good at integrating large crowds of people in convincing three-dimensional architecture. You can see there is painted architecture in this picture that goes back into space in one point perspective, and the crowd is arranged within this space. By the way, everybody in this painting is somebody famous from the ancient world that a good Renaissance humanist would know about. Uh, Already mentioned Plato and Aristotle. I should also mention that Plato, the man on the left, is actually a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, whom Raphael admired. The School of Athens also contains a portrait of Michelangelo. He is the man who is brooding alone with his elbow on a writing table. He is depicted as Heraclitus, and it's interesting that Raphael chooses to put him off from the rest of the people, perhaps suggesting his reputation and personality as a loner. Raphael also inserts his own portrait into the School of Athens. He is in the lower right corner, and here's a detail of the crowd of people in the lower right corner. In this little crop, Raphael is the second one from the right. He's wearing what looks like a black beret. He's kind of the young-looking man with the longish hair, so he kind of peeks around the corner as if to place himself in the company of all these great people. Now, a closing thought, especially about this painting. Remember that the Italian Renaissance, one of the things we see again and again in the art is this attempt to join together Christian theology and pagan learning and pagan mythology. And if you think about it in that context, it's pretty easy to understand why the School of Athens would have been an appealing subject matter, even for a pope. This painting really captures the humanist and, in many ways, Greek revival kind of spirit of the Italian Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance is happening in other parts of the world as well, not just Italy, and there's great art being produced in places like Spain and Germany and the Netherlands. Our next module is going to look at some of that art. We'll travel to other parts of Europe and see how this rebirth of culture and learning is affecting artists in other countries. So I will see you then.